Okay, we're going to be looking at some information from Chapter 3 of our textbook, and we're going to really zone in on questionnaire design. The objectives for this unit are to learn the language of surveys and research. So at the end of this lecture, I definitely want you to know the difference between open-ended versus closed-ended questions, the definitions of variables versus constants, independent and dependent variables, and nominal, ordinal, and interval ratio levels of measurement. If all of those words look foreign to you, that's normal. You've never taken a statistics course before. So you're going to learn all of this language and you're going to start using it and hearing it and you're going to do better. We're also going to look at how to avoid the known issues with survey questions. We'll look at some pitfalls that people commonly fall into. And when I use the language of things like double-barreled question, you'll say, oh yeah, that's one of the things we had to avoid. You taught me about that. And we'll finish today with ethics. So let's move forward. So what's the difference between an open-ended and a closed-ended question? Best way to figure this out is to see some examples. So this is an open-ended question that you'd see on a survey. Respondents can answer the question in any manner. For example, how would you describe your relationship with your parents? If you put this question on a survey, somebody could write one sentence. Somebody could write an essay. And you just let them type their answer in there. Well, when I was a young boy, my parents used to, take me to church. And you just tell your story, right? That's an open-ended question. The person can take it anywhere. Closed-ended questions, in contrast, the respondent is given a number or selects from a set of predetermined responses. So, for example, during periods where I experience a lot of stress in my life, I will ask my parents for help. The respondent can say strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. There's a set of predetermined responses, and that's all the responses that were given them, right? They have to choose one of those 5. I would also point out that when we bring this question into a statistical data package like we're going to use, we would usually make strongly agree 1, agree 2, neutral 3, disagree 4, strongly agree 5. We actually give numbers to the choices, and then when you look at the database, it's rows of 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s, but we know that the 1 really means strongly agree, and the 5 really means strongly disagree. So that's one of the things we do with closed-ended questions. We use words, but then we turn the words into numbers. Okay, well, that's a good way of starting off our introduction to surveys, but how do you write questions? Well, there's 3 general guidelines. First, you follow an order determined by topics. You don't want to jump from topic to topic. You shouldn't say, what's your relationship like with your parents? Do you like to eat waffles? What kind of music do you listen to? You shouldn't be jumping all over the place. Your questions should have a certain sort of theme to them, and you stick to that theme. And when you're going to go to another set of questions, you're going to a new theme, okay? So follow an order of topics. It shouldn't jump from all over the place. Within each topic, start with a general question before going to specifics. So we're going to start really broad, and we're going to work our way towards more specific things. So maybe we say something like, were you raised by both of your parents? Very broad. We're just trying to figure out, from 0 to 18, did your parents stay together or was there a divorce? Something along those lines. Then we start working towards what type of relationship. Would you ask them for help? Did you feel close to them? We're working towards more specific. It's also good to start with questions that are not very sensitive in your survey. If your first question on your survey is, how do you like to have sex? People might see that first question and say, ooh, no, this is not okay, and push your survey to the side. So if your question's very sensitive, you're not going to ask people their annual income, question 1, or about their sexual habits, or things like that. You want to ease people into that, kind of like a dating situation, where you get to know somebody little by little. Towards the end, you sort of maybe get that sensitive information after they're invested in the survey. Questions that are the most important for your analysis should go towards the top. I kind of find it boring when the first question on a survey is, what's your sex? Are you male or are you female? Things like that. It's a little boring. It doesn't make anybody want to take your survey. So you kind of want to start your survey with something that actually makes people care about your survey. So if your survey is about the cost of textbooks, you want to start with a question that actually is important for your research and ask about textbooks. Don't start with something like, what's your sex, what's your gender, what's your race. People find that stuff not enticing. Order matters. Number 2, phrasing of questions. That matters too. When we write questions, we want to avoid ambiguous language. We want to be clear, unambiguous. We also want to avoid what's called research jargon. In a lot of your psychology courses, you might have learned, this like very highfalutin language of psychology, talking about the id and the ego and the superego. You don't want to put that stuff in your survey. Surveys are usually written at sort of like an 8th grade level. So you don't want to try to test people on their knowledge of the world. What is your attachment style? People might say, I don't know what an attachment style is. I'm not a psychology major. So avoid research jargon. Don't use any abbreviations or acronyms. You also want to be specific about who the question refers to. Are we talking about me or my household? So if somebody says, how much money do you make? I assume they're talking about me, Michael Danza. But a lot of times we want to know about household income. Because somebody who's 18 might say, I don't make any money. I have a $0 a year, annual income. But meanwhile, their parents are making $200,000 a year. So whenever you ask a question, we want to know who you're referring to. Are you referring to the household? Are you referring to an individual? Are you asking about somebody's parents? Or are you asking about them? You also want to be explicit about the time period that's being referenced. You might want to say something like from 0 to 18, did you live with your parents 100% of the time, 90% of the time, 0% of the time, something like that. But you want to be very specific on the period. If you're asking a question like, how much money do you make? We might want to know, are we talking about monthly or annually? You want to be very specific on that. Don't just say, how much money do you make? Way too open-ended. We want more close-ended. And we also want to be explicit about what we're referencing. Whenever possible, you want to be as clear in your language as possible. And this has a huge impact on the results. We actually do research on the language we use in surveys and how it impacts the results. So here's some examples. You want to avoid making assumptions about respondents that's not verified in the previous question. So if I say to somebody, how old is your oldest child? Well, that assumes that the person has at least one child. What if they don't? You can't ask that question. How much do you pay in rent? It assumes that you're renting your home. What is your favorite radio station? It assumes that you listen to the radio. What state were you born in? It assumes that the person was born in the United States. So you want to be careful with all of your assumptions. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to write our survey questions and we're going to peer review it. We're going to send your survey to different people and everyone will look at your survey. And usually we catch this stuff. The other thing you want to avoid, another problem, is called double-barreled questions. Questions that may have 2 or more responses. Here's a great example. How often do you purchase gasoline and how much do you spend? Well, what if I take the bus and I spend 0? That's a double-barreled question because I can't say yes or no to either part of it. So avoid double-barreled questions. You also want to ensure that questions have a neutral option that don't leave respondents in a certain way to answer. There's been a lot of research on this. If you say, do you believe people deserve welfare? People will say they're against it because it's not a neutral phrasing. If you say, do you approve of aid to women and children? People will say yes. So you want to ensure that the language you're using for your questions is neutral. One semester I had a student that wanted to do a survey on police shootings and of unarmed men, and she wanted to use the word murder. Do you approve of police murdering unarmed men? And we talked to that student, everyone in the class, and said, that language, it's going to impact your results. And people might not even take your survey if they see the word murder in there, So So we have to be careful with our language, and generally we want to choose something that doesn't show we're on one side of the political spectrum or the other. We're these neutral, objective scientists that ask good questions. So here's our great examples. You want to avoid leading questions. So here's one that's leading towards a yes on welfare. Do you feel the government has a moral responsibility to assist families in need through no fault of their own? The person who wrote that question wanted a yes answer, and that's what they're going to get, right? What about the other side? Do you support the use of your hard-earned tax dollars to hand out welfare checks to people? The word handout, hard-earned dollars, you're biased, you're trying to get people to say no. So we really want to look at the questions themselves and how they're phrased and make sure they're not leading one way or the other, but right down the middle. Next question. Do you agree the government should be investing more in our crumbling infrastructure to promote economic growth? That person wants a yes. They have a leading question. Let's look at the other side. Do you think the government should indulge in runaway spending on pork barrel projects that could worsen the fiscal deficit? This person wants to know. And our last example, City Health Code. Do you support the new city health law that would strengthen the health code and protect people from unsanitary conditions in restaurants? You're going to get a lot of yeses. Do you support the new city regulations on restaurants that impose unnecessary costs on family businesses and threaten food service jobs? That person wants to know. So we are scientists. We are not trying to lead people towards one answer or the other. We want to see what they think on it without the leading questions. So if I say to you, hey, I think your question is leading, I am referring to this phenomena, and I hope that you understand what I'm saying and can make it more neutral. There is also an element that we talked about in class called social desirability bias. It's the tendency of respondents to give answers that are socially acceptable rather than accurate. So if we ask people about racism, pretty much most people in America today are like, I'm not a racist and I'm against racism. And that's because they know that that's what is socially desirable. Nobody wants to be a racist today. So everyone, when they answer a survey, they totally are offering answers that's very much affirmative, that they're anti-racist. But we know this is going on, and we're trying to sort of be scientists. So we're trying to figure out slick, new, and interesting ways to sort of see what's really going on and take into account social desirability bias. I won't go into it, but there's a whole field of psychology called implicit bias that's trying to get at the inner workings of our cognition to show the prejudice and the bias that when you ask on a survey, everyone says I'm not a racist, but when you do that deeper dive inside people's brains, you see that there is a tendency to think favorably about certain groups and unfavorably about other groups. And it's still in our brains. On a conscious level, nobody wants to be a racist, but on an unconscious level, it's still there. So scholars are trying to deal with this particular issue. It's not really something we can deal with on surveys unless you're super innovative and try something really cool. But for the most part, yeah, they're using new methodology. And the last thing we're going to end here with is just always keep in mind when you're writing your questions to keep time and units in the forefront of your mind. How old are you? The age at your last birthday. How tall is your child, expressed in centimeters or inches or feet or whatever it is? You want to tell the people that they're all using the same units. We can't have some people giving answers in centimeters and other people giving answers in feet. It does not work. So you want to have everyone in the same units. Okay? So that's very important for just creating good survey questions. Always give them a time frame for their questions or sort of units that they can use. We're going to end on ethical issues. Basically, the long story that I'm trying to keep short is that for a long time, a lot of researchers did horrible things to people. Really bad. In the United States, in Germany, all over the world, there was a lot of medical research done to people, and horrible things were done. In response to these horrible things, like the Tuskegee syphilis study, where the government gave syphilis to black men and just to see what would happen and let the disease run its course, in response to these horrible atrocities, Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974, which led to the Belmont Report in 1979. These reports basically led to what's called an Institutional Review Board, an IRB, where you have certified and regulated by the Office of Human Research Protections of the Department of Health and Human Services. Basically, if you're going to do research on humans, you need to have oversight. We can't just electrocute people or stick people in prisons or give them diseases or try to give them medicine. Whenever there's humans involved with research, we have to think about ethics, and there must be oversight. So at our college, I do not want you collecting data from anyone without my permission. That's how research works in the sociology and the psychology department. We don't collect data without a teacher's permission because we have to think about ethics. Well, what do we have to think about? Okay, well, for your final project, you are going to need approval from me. I am the IRB at this college, basically. And this is what is required: an informed consent. The respondent must give approval for participation after receiving information about the study and their involvement. They need to be informed of what this is about. They must be given confidentiality, where no one's going to be able to identify them. You should not be recording IP addresses. You shouldn't be asking for email addresses. Everything should be confidential, and we shouldn't know who they are. Okay? And the last thing is that there should be some assurance that the costs and risks to the participants are justified by the benefit to the public at large. Sometimes in social research, we do deceive people. We do lie. We do even cause a little bit of harm sometimes in order to study things in the social world. But for the most part, we try to avoid those deceiving people. We try to avoid hurting people. But if there is going to be any pain involved, we need to tell people, hey, there might be some psychological harm, or this might trigger you and cause some trauma, and we want to let you know before we even start the research. So that's the ethical issues that I want you to think about. At the beginning of surveys that we do at our course and for our final project, we will have an informed consent form. You will tell people about their rights, about their their data will be confidential, and I do not want you collecting data without thinking about ethics and having the teacher's approval. Okay, I hope you have a good one.